Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into the deepest, most foundational story of heroism ever told. Forget Achilles, dismiss Hercules, and set aside the Norse myths for just a moment. Tonight, you stand at the edge of a vast, unforgiving desert, and before you is the clay tablet of a myth so old its words crackle with the dust of millennia. We are going back to a time before gods were universally worshipped, before the pantheons were set in stone. What if I told you that the very first hero wasn't a selfless champion, but a terrible tyrant? Probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear, but this ancient legend reveals that the very first hero's journey began with a profound, almost unforgivable act of cruelty. So, before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and the local time in the comments. Now close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The tale begins not in a golden palace or on Mount Olympus, but in a city made of mud brick and ambition. Uruk, in ancient Mesopotamia. This is the oldest civilization we have any record of, the literal cradle of humanity. A place so old that we still find clay tablets with recipes for beer and laundry lists etched into them. And in this vibrant, burgeoning metropolis, there lived a king named Gilgamesh. The stories describe him as a being of immense, almost unfathomable power. A Sumerian legend from around 2100 BC, one of the earliest texts we have, introduces him as something more than mortal. He was born of the goddess Ninsan, a powerful deity, but his father was a mortal king, Lugalbanda. This mix of divine and human lineage made him a singular figure, 2/3 god and 1/3 human. It's a very strange ratio, isn't it? It's not a half-god like many other mythological figures, but 2 parts divine to 1 part mortal. This unique blend of natures, this powerful and strange genealogy is the key to understanding him. He possessed the strength and immortality of the gods, yet he was burdened by the very human capacity for sorrow, pain, and most importantly, the terror of death. He was a being caught between 2 worlds, and that tension would ultimately define his entire existence and the path he would take. But the question that remains, the one that the scribes of old never quite answered, was which part the god or the mortal would ultimately win out in the end? The question of Gilgamesh's nature, the tension between his divine and mortal selves, manifested in his reign as the king of Uruk. Imagine a ruler who is more than a king, a being so magnificent and powerful that he doesn't just rule his people, he overwhelms them. He was a builder, yes, an architect of immense walls and grand temples. The sheer scale of his constructions was a testament to his divine heritage. But this magnificence came at a terrible price. His power made him arrogant, his immortality made him cruel, and his divine blood made him believe he was untouchable. You wouldn't believe the things the ancient tablets tell us about him. They described Gilgamesh as a merciless tyrant who took whatever he desired. He would steal brides from their grooms and force his will upon the young women of his city. He would work his men to the bone, building his monuments, never granting them rest. He was a force of nature, a living hurricane of power and pride that swept through the lives of his subjects, leaving them broken and exhausted. A small bizarre fact from a Mesopotamian myth is that the gods themselves had strange specific habits. For example, the goddess of beer, Ninkasi, had a recipe so detailed that scholars believe it was meant to be sung. So, even as the divine beings were creating songs for brewing, their half-mortal descendant was bringing his city to its knees. The people of Uruk lived in terror, not just of foreign invaders, but of their own king. His acts were not just the actions of a bad ruler, they were the whims of a deity who had forgotten empathy. The citizens lived in a state of perpetual fear, and every sunset brought with it the dread of what the king of Uruk might demand next. They were trapped, living under the shadow of a colossal living monument to hubris. But the question that remained was, how do you stand against a god? The people of Uruk, with nowhere else to turn, did the only thing they could. They raised their pleas and their prayers to the heavens. Their voices, a chorus of despair and desperation, reached the ears of the great gods in their celestial abodes. Gods, the same ones who had crafted this strange 2/3 divine king, heard the cries of the mortals. The epic recounts the anguish of the city and the direct appeal to the powerful deities, saying that Gilgamesh's lust has no equal. His violence is unchecked. The gods who created humanity to serve them were suddenly faced with a problem of their own making. This was not a problem of mortal governance. This was an issue of cosmic imbalance. The king they had endowed with such immense power was now using it to torment the very people who were supposed to be their loyal subjects. In many pantheons, from Greek mythology to Norse legends, the gods are often fickle, but here they had a specific duty to maintain the order of the world. A small but fascinating historical fact is that in ancient Mesopotamia, the gods were not just worshipped in temples. Their statues were fed and clothed daily by priests in elaborate rituals. A practice that highlights the deep symbiotic relationship people believed they had with their deities. The gods heard the lamentations of their servants, and they decided that something had to be done. The solution they conceived was not to kill Gilgamesh for his divine heritage, made him too difficult to simply dispatch, but to distract him, to exhaust his boundless energy. They would create an equal, a rival, someone who could match his strength and occupy his attention. They needed an antidote to his unchecked power. But the question that remained was, what kind of being could possibly stand against a demigod? The gods convened, and their solution was as audacious as it was unprecedented. They decided to create a being who was the very antithesis of Gilgamesh. If the king was a creature of the city, of civilization and rule, his rival would be a creature of the wild, of nature and untamed power. The goddess Aruru, the creator of mankind, was tasked with this monumental undertaking. You could almost feel the god's creative energy pulsing through the cosmos, as she needs clay, much like a potter. She took a pinch of clay, dipped her hands in water, and fashioned a being that would be the mirror image of Gilgamesh's strength, but without his tyrannical corruption. From her hands came Enkidu. Enkidu was a primal man, a being of pure, unadulterated nature. The ancient tablets describe him as being covered in hair, living among the animals of the steppe. He drank from the same watering holes as the gazelles and grazed with the wild beasts. He was a part of the natural world, kind of mythical counterpart to a real historical figure like the wild man of Borneo legends. This creature, part human, part animal, was the god's masterstroke, a living force of nature, designed to humble a king. Enkidu was not born with a sword in his hand or a crown on his head. He was a walking, breathing monument to everything that Gilgamesh had abandoned in his quest for power. This contrast was intentional, a cosmic check and balance. The gods did not just want to end Gilgamesh's tyranny. They wanted to re-establish the balance between the wild and the civilized. An interesting detail about Enkidu's existence is that his body was so powerful that it could break the traps that hunters set in the wilderness. Hunters who tried to capture animals were thwarted by this shaggy, powerful figure who would simply tear their nets and fill in their pits. The very land seemed to recognize him as its own. But the question that lingered in the gods' minds was, would this wild man be able to understand his purpose? And more importantly, would he be able to defeat a being who was 2/3 divine? Enkidu's existence was a problem for the hunters of the steppe. They were simple men, trying to make a living, and this strange, powerful man of the wild was ruining their livelihood. They brought their troubles to Gilgamesh, unaware that they were setting in motion the gods' grand plan. Gilgamesh, in a show of his arrogance and power, decided on a truly bizarre solution. Instead of sending a warrior, he sent a temple priestess, a harlot named Shemhat. His logic was that if Enkidu was a creature of the wild, he could be domesticated, brought into the fold of civilization by the very forces of humanity. This is one of the most intriguing parts of the epic. It's a story not just about physical power, but about the nature of civilization itself. Shamhat found Enkidu at a watering hole, and she spent 7 days and 7 nights with him. These 7 days were not just a physical encounter. They were a profound psychological and spiritual transformation. She taught him to eat bread and drink beer, things he had never known. Taught him to wear clothing and to speak. He was no longer a beast of the field. He was becoming a man. As he shed his animal nature, a strange thing happened. The gazelles and the wild creatures, his former companions, began to shy away from him. They could sense the change, the shift from a creature of the wild to a creature of the city. A fascinating detail from ancient Mesopotamian culture is the role of the priestesses, or harlots like Shamhat. They were not just sex workers in the modern sense. They held a semi-divine status, and their acts were often seen as sacred, a bridge between the mortal and the divine worlds. It was a remarkable way to civilize a hero not through a sword, but through a human connection. But the question that remained was, now that Enkidu was a man, would he still be able to fulfill his divine purpose of challenging the tyrannical king of Uruk? The transformation of Enkidu was complete. He was no longer a wild beast, but a man of immense strength, now fully aware of the world of humans. Shemhat, having fulfilled her role, led him towards the city of Uruk, where his destiny awaited. Imagine the scene: a city of towering walls, a bustling, noisy place, and a man who has never known anything but the quiet of the wilderness, walking towards its center. But before he could even reach Gilgamesh, Enkidu witnessed an act that enraged him. He saw Gilgamesh preparing to exercise his tyrannical right of the first night, a practice where the king would take any bride he desired on her wedding night. The sight of this profound injustice ignited a fire within Enkidu. The anger he felt was not just a primal rage. It was a righteous fury against the king's abuse of power. The two beings, the wild man and the demigod king, met in the street. The epic describes their confrontation with a raw, visceral power. Gilgamesh, seeing this stranger blocking his path, challenged him, a smirk on his face, believing no one could stand against him. Enkidu, however, was not afraid. He was a force of nature, a mountain of a man who would not bend to the will of a king. The battle began. The very foundations of the city shook. You can almost hear the clang of their fists against each other, the groans of stone as the city walls tremble under their might. It was not a fight of skill, but of sheer unbridled power, a duel between civilization's strongest and nature's finest. A strange historical detail about ancient Sumerian cities is that their city gates were considered sacred, a threshold between the chaotic outside world and the ordered world within. The fact that this battle happened at the gates of Uruk is deeply symbolic, representing the clash of these two opposing forces. The epic describes Gilgamesh for the first time in his life being pushed back, his arrogance meeting its equal. But the question that remained was, would this battle end in death, or would it forge an entirely new destiny for both men? The battle raged. The citizens of Uruk watched in stunned silence as their tyrannical king was finally challenged. The clash between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was a test of not just strength, but of will. Gilgamesh, who had never known defeat, found himself facing a being who could match his every move. His divine blood met a force of nature that was its equal. The fight was a psychological one too. For Gilgamesh, it was a test of his absolute power, a moment to prove that he was still the most formidable being on the planet. For Enkidu, it was a test of his purpose, a chance to fulfill his divine mandate to humble the king. As the two figures fought, the ground beneath their feet cracked, and the dust of Uruk rose up in a storm around them. The epic describes a point where Gilgamesh, in a moment of pure strength, pinned Enkidu, but the wild man did not break. He held his ground with an unyielding resilience that surprised the king. A bizarre detail about this fight is that in some versions of the myth, the two combatants don't even use weapons. It's a raw fist-to-fist brawl, a testament to their immense physical power. Then, something unexpected happened. Gilgamesh, who had only known domination, saw something in Enkidu. He saw not a defeated foe, but a reflection of his own power, his own unbridled might. And in that moment he felt not rage, but a strange sense of kinship, a profound respect for this man who had dared to stand against him. The battle ended not with a final blow, but with a silent understanding. Gilgamesh released Enkidu, and in that moment their rivalry transformed into a bond of brotherhood. They embraced, their long, arduous battle now serving as the foundation for a deep and lasting friendship. Gilgamesh, the lonely, arrogant demigod, had finally found an equal. But the question that lingered was, what would two beings of such immense power do with their newfound bond? With their friendship forged, Gilgamesh and Enkidu's boundless energy and power needed an outlet. Gilgamesh, no longer content with his life of tyranny and excess, sought a new purpose, needed a legend, an epic quest to prove his worth, not just to himself, but to the world. He proposed a journey to a place of great danger and mystery, the Cedar Forest. This wasn't just any forest. It was a sacred domain, a place where the gods themselves lived, guarded by a formidable demon. The cedar forest was the source of the rare, valuable timber that was used to build the gods' temples and the king's palaces. It was a place of immense beauty and immense peril. Gilgamesh's desire was to slay its guardian, the monstrous Humbaba, and to chop down the sacred cedar trees to build a gate for Uruk, a symbol of his newfound greatness. Enkidu, now a man of the city, was initially against this plan. He knew the dangers of the cedar forest better than anyone, for it was a place where the untamed forces of nature reigned supreme. He tried to dissuade his friend, reminding him that Humbaba was no ordinary foe. But Gilgamesh, filled with the fire of newfound purpose, was not to be swayed. He wanted to leave a legacy, a name that would be remembered forever. He wanted to become a hero. A bizarre detail about this part of the journey is that before they set out, Gilgamesh has strange prophetic dreams that Enkidu, with his unique knowledge of the god's will, is able to interpret. These dreams give them a sense of cosmic purpose, a feeling that their quest is not just a whim, but a divine mandate. The two heroes gathered their weapons and set off on their perilous journey. A journey that would take them far from the safety of Uruk and into the heart of the unknown. They were no longer a tyrant and his rival. They were now a pair of epic heroes on a mission. But the question that remained was, Would they be able to face a monster that was created by the gods themselves? The journey to the cedar forest was long and arduous. For months, Gilgamesh and Enkidu traveled through vast deserts and over towering mountains. The path was not just a physical one. It was a spiritual pilgrimage, a test of their endurance and their bond. The closer they got to their destination, the more their surroundings began to change. The air grew still, and the scent of the cedar trees, a sweet and powerful aroma, filled their senses. The forest itself was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary where the gods and goddesses of the pantheon had placed their favor. It was a place of oral beauty, where the wind through the trees sounded like a god's whisper, and the streams sang a song that predated humanity. But guarding this beautiful sacred place was a monster of unimaginable horror. Humbaba. The epic describes Humbaba as a being of raw terror. His roar was like a hurricane, his speech was fire, and his breath was death. His face was a bizarre mix of grotesquerie, with the tangled entrails of animals wrapped around his head, and a mouth that was a mass of gnarled teeth. He was a creature of divine command, created by the storm god Enlil, to be the guardian of the forest. The forest itself was not just Humbaba's home, it was his clothing, a fact that highlights the deep connection between the demon and the land he protected. He was the embodiment of the forest's untamed and dangerous nature. A fascinating historical detail is that in ancient Mesopotamia, the forests were often seen as chaotic. Wild places, the antithesis of the ordered city. Humbaba was the personification of this fear, a reminder of the dangers that lay outside the walls of civilization. As the two heroes finally stood at the edge of the sacred grove, the air grew thick with a sense of dread. The silence was palpable, broken only by the distant, chilling roar of the guardian. Enkidu, who had a deeper connection to this wild world, felt the immense power of Humbaba and tried once again to persuade Gilgamesh to turn back. But Gilgamesh, driven by his quest for fame, would not be swayed. But the question that remained was, would their combined strength be enough to defeat a monster whose very purpose was to kill them? Gilgamesh and Enkidu entered the cedar forest, a place so ancient and grand that it felt like they were walking through the beginning of time. They found Humbaba, the forest's monstrous guardian, and the battle was joined. The fight was a symphony of destruction. You could almost hear the roar of Humbaba, a sound so powerful that it could level a tree, and the defiant shouts of the heroes as they charged. The ground shook with their every step. The trees, ancient and revered, splintered under the force of their blows. Humbaba, with his immense strength and terrifying power, fought back with a fury that was both primal and divine. He was a force of nature, a living hurricane that sought to engulf the two men. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought as one, their combined strength a perfect match for the demon's might. Gilgamesh used his divine strength and Enkidu used his primal knowledge of the wild. Together they were a force that the forest had never seen before. It was a bloody, brutal affair, a true clash of titans. At the height of the battle, the gods themselves, particularly the sun god Shamash, intervened, sending 13 winds to bind and disorient Humbaba. This divine intervention, a clear example of God's meddling in mortal affairs, turned the tide of the battle. Humbaba, now weakened and confused, was at their mercy. A bizarre detail from the myth is that at this moment, Humbaba pleads with Gilgamesh, begging for mercy, promising to be his servant and to cut wood for him. But Enkidu, remembering Humbaba's cruelty and their sacred mission, urges Gilgamesh to show no mercy, to kill the beast before the gods change their minds. Gilgamesh, listening to his friend, plunged his sword into the demon's heart. The silence that followed was deafening. The forest, now without its guardian, was still. The heroes had won, but their victory was not without consequence. They had killed a creature of divine command, and in doing so, they had angered the very gods who had sent Enkidu to humble Gilgamesh. The question that remained was, what would the gods' vengeance look like, and could they survive it? Gilgamesh and Enkidu, now victorious, chopped down the cedar trees, a symbol of their conquest, and used the timber to build a magnificent gate for the city of Uruk. They returned as heroes, their names now legend. Gilgamesh's tyranny was forgotten, replaced by the awe and respect of his people. The city rejoiced, and the two heroes were celebrated with feasts and parades. But their victory had not gone unnoticed by the gods. The goddess, Ishtar, the deity of love and war, watched from the heavens. She saw Gilgamesh no longer a tyrant, but a magnificent hero, a being of immense beauty and power, and she was captivated. She descended to Uruk and proposed marriage to him. She offered him a life of immense wealth and power, a chariot of lapis lazuli and gold, and a kingdom where her devotees would be his subjects. For a human king, even a two-thirds divine one, this would have been an unimaginable honor, an offer that no one would dare refuse. But Gilgamesh, in a moment of hubris that rivals his earlier tyranny, rejected her. He mocked her, recalling all the lovers she had had and then abandoned, from the lion to the shepherd, and pointing out that she would do the same to him. It was a vicious, calculated insult, a moment of psychological intrigue that shows the depth of Gilgamesh's newfound arrogance. He saw her offer as a trap, a promise that she would one day discard him like she had all her other lovers. A bizarre detail from the myths is that Ishtar, the goddess of love, was also a fearsome warrior, and in some versions of the story her lovers were not just abandoned. They were turned into grotesque beasts forever marked by her cruelty. Gilgamesh was not just rejecting her, he was publicly humiliating a goddess with a long and brutal history of revenge. The goddess, enraged by his refusal and his taunts, returned to the heavens with a fury that shook the very cosmos. She demanded vengeance, not just for herself, but for the honor of all the gods. But the question that remained was, what kind of a cosmic fury would a scorned goddess unleash upon a mortal hero? Ishtar's rage was a force of nature. Humiliated by Gilgamesh's taunts and his cold rejection, she ascended to the heavens and went to her father, Anu, the supreme god of the sky. She stood before him, weeping and screaming, her fury so great that it threatened to disrupt the very order of the cosmos. She demanded vengeance, insisting that Anu give her the bull of heaven to destroy Gilgamesh and the city of Uruk. Anu, however, was reluctant. He knew that unleashing the bull of heaven, a powerful and destructive divine creature, would not only destroy Gilgamesh, but would also cause a catastrophic famine and drought that would last for 7 years. He tried to reason with his daughter, reminding her of the terrible consequences of her rage. But Ishtar was not to be reasoned with. She threatened to unleash the dead from the underworld, a truly bizarre and terrifying threat that showed the depths of her fury. In some ancient Mesopotamian beliefs, the dead were buried in a place where they ate dust and clay, and their release would cause a cataclysm of unimaginable horror. Faced with his daughter's unyielding fury and her bizarre threat, Anu relented. He handed her the tether of the Bull of Heaven, a creature of immense power and cosmic rage. The epic describes Ishtar now with the Bull of Heaven in tow, descending from the heavens like a bolt of lightning, her rage palpable. Her purpose was clear, to wreak a terrible vengeance upon the man who had dared to mock her and to destroy the city that had celebrated him. The people of Uruk, who had just celebrated their heroes, were about to face a wrath far greater than any tyrannical king. But the question that remained was, would Gilgamesh and Enkidu be able to defeat a divine creature of such immense power, and would they be able to save their city from the god's wrath? The bull of heaven descended upon Uruk with a roar that was the sound of a world ending. The earth trembled under its feet, and with every bellow, it created sinkholes that swallowed hundreds of people. The beast was a walking catastrophe, a living embodiment of divine fury. The people of Uruk, who had lived in fear of their king, now faced a far greater terror. The bull of heaven was not just a beast. It was a cosmic force, a weapon of the gods designed for mass destruction. It tore through the city, its hooves shattering buildings, and its breath scorching the ground. For every bellow, a fissure would open up in the earth and the ground would swallow 300 men. The city was in chaos, its once celebrated walls now crumbling under the weight of divine punishment. This event is not just a myth. It is a chilling psychological reflection on the nature of divine retribution in ancient minds. They believed that a god's fury could manifest as a natural disaster, like a drought or an earthquake. The bull of heaven was this belief made flesh, a physical manifestation of a god's rage. A small strange detail from the myth is that the bull of heaven was so powerful that when it came, it caused the Euphrates River to overflow its banks. A detail that mirrors the very real and very destructive floods that were a constant threat to ancient Mesopotamian cities. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who had just been celebrating their victory, now faced their greatest challenge. They were the ones who had angered the gods, and now it was up to them to save their city. The two heroes stood before the divine beast, their human strength pitted against cosmic power. They had no divine winds to aid them this time. They were on their own. But the question that lingered was, could two mortal heroes defeat a creature so powerful that it could level a city and cause a famine? The battle against the bull of heaven was a spectacle of raw, unbridled power. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, their newfound brotherhood now a weapon, fought with a coordination that was almost supernatural. They dodged the beast's charges and sidestepped its fiery breath. The city of Uruk, once a source of Gilgamesh's arrogance, now became the battlefield for its salvation. Enkidu, using his deep knowledge of the wild and the beasts within it, was able to read the creature's movements, a bizarre detail that highlights his unique connection to nature. He knew its tells, its weak points, and its primal fury. Gilgamesh, in turn, used his immense 2/3 divine strength to distract and engage the bull head-on. The bull was a cosmic beast, and the fight was not just physical, but symbolic of fight for the very survival of humanity against the fickle, destructive nature of the gods. The epic recounts a moment when Enkidu, in a display of incredible bravery, taunts the bull, drawing its attention away from Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, seizing the opportunity, plunges his sword into the back of the bull's neck, a fatal blow that brought the cosmic creature to its knees. The bull of heaven fell, and its death bellow was a sound of immense cosmic defeat. With its last breath, the creature was vanquished. But the victory was not without its own moment of hubris. Enkidu, in a final act of defiance, ripped the bull's thigh from its body and threw it at Ishtar, who was watching from the city walls. This was a direct, unapologetic act of defiance, a moment where a mortal or a near-mortal challenged the power of a goddess. Historical fact of the time is that in ancient mythology, throwing an object at a deity was considered a profound act of disrespect. This moment, a simple yet powerful gesture, sealed their fate. They had not only defeated the god's wrath, they had insulted it. The question that remained was, how would the gods, now doubly humiliated, respond to this unforgivable act of defiance? The gods, a pantheon of powerful and vengeful beings, convened in the heavens. The defeat of the bull of heaven and Enkidu's direct insult to Ishtar was an affront that could not be ignored. They had to restore the cosmic balance to show that their power was not something to be trifled with. They debated what to do with Gilgamesh and Enkidu. The two heroes were too powerful to be easily killed, and their actions had made them legends in the mortal world. The god Enlil, who was the patron of the Cedar forest, was especially furious. His creature Humbaba had been killed, and his divine forest had been desecrated. The gods decided on a truly cruel and psychologically devastating punishment. They would not kill Gilgamesh, for his divine heritage protected him. But Enkidu, the man who had been created to humble Gilgamesh, and who had a mortal's heart, was not so protected. They decided that Enkidu would die. Not in battle, not in a moment of heroic glory, but slowly and painfully, from an unknown illness. It was a punishment designed to break Gilgamesh, not just to punish Enkidu. The epic recounts the chilling moment when Enkidu has a prophetic dream, a vision of the gods' assembly. In this dream, he overhears their terrible decision, sees the god S verdict. Let one of the two of them must die. This dream, bizarre detail that serves as a forewarning, is a chilling reminder of the gods' power and their cruel, manipulative nature. A historical fact from ancient Mesopotamian belief is that dreams were seen as direct messages from the gods, a way for them to communicate their will to mortals. Enkidu's dream was not just a nightmare, it was a divine prophecy. He wakes up with a terrible fever, his body racked with a mysterious illness that no one could cure. The gods were not just punishing him. They were showing Gilgamesh that even his two-thirds divine power could not save his mortal friend. But the question that remained was, how would a king, who had never known loss, handle the slow, agonizing death of his only true friend? The death of Enkidu was not a quick, heroic end. It was a slow, agonizing descent into darkness. Gilgamesh watched, helpless, as his friend's body was consumed by a mysterious illness. The man who had faced down gods and monsters was now brought low by an invisible sickness. Cruel psychological punishment from the gods. Enkidu in his final days was filled with a bitter rage. He cursed the city, the hunter who had found him, and the harlot who had brought him into civilization, a complete reversal of his previous enlightenment. He believed that his life, his purpose, had been a cosmic joke, a cruel setup that had led him to this miserable end. Gilgamesh, meanwhile, was in the throes of a profound, devastating grief. He sat at his friend's bedside, watching his life ebb away. He held his friend's hand, pleading with the gods, with the heavens, and with the very earth to spare him. He was a king, a demigod, and yet he was utterly powerless. The epic describes Gilgamesh, his once magnificent body now racked with sorrow, tearing at his hair and his clothes. His grief was so immense that it was a physical force, a tangible weight in the room. This emotional turmoil is a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. He was no longer the all-powerful king. He was a mortal man mourning the loss of his brother. A bizarre detail is that Gilgamesh's grief was so strong that when Enkidu finally died, Gilgamesh held his body for 6 days. In 6 nights, refusing to let go, hoping that some divine spark would return to him. This act of holding on to the dead, this refusal to accept the finality of death, is a profoundly human one. It was a psychological breakdown, a moment where the 2/3 divine Gilgamesh was brought to his knees by his 1/3 mortal heart. This was the moment his heroic journey truly began. The question that remained was, how would this profound loss, this unshakable terror of death, shape the rest of his life in his quest for a different kind of immortality? The death of Enkidu was a devastating blow, but it also sparked a profound change in Gilgamesh. For the first time, he was confronted with the terrifying reality of his own mortality. He had seen his friend, a being of immense strength and power, brought low by a sickness that he couldn't fight. This was not a death in battle, but a slow, agonizing fade into nothingness. Gilgamesh, who had lived his entire life believing he was untouchable, was now faced with a terrifying and inescapable truth. He too would one day die. His divine blood, which had once felt like a shield against all harm, now felt like a cruel cosmic joke. The two-thirds divine part of him screamed that he should be immortal, but the one-third human part of him felt the cold, creeping dread of the end. He became obsessed with this fear. He left the city of Uruk, shedding his royal clothes and donning the skins of a hunter. His once magnificent body became gaunt, his face lined with the terror of his own inevitable end. He began a new quest, a journey not for fame or glory, but for a solution to the one problem that no one had ever been able to solve: death. He sought a man named Utnapishtim, a being who was said to be the sole survivor of the Great Flood, and who, because of his survival, had been granted immortality by the gods. He was Gilgamesh's only hope, his one shot at escaping the fate that had consumed his friend. A fascinating historical detail is that the story of Utnapishtim and the flood is a clear precursor to the biblical story of Noah and the Ark, a fact that shows how deeply this myth permeated ancient culture. Gilgamesh's quest was no longer about a tyrant seeking power or a hero seeking glory. It was about a man, a broken man, seeking to defy his very nature. He was no longer a king. He was a desperate mortal, a man on a mission to find the secret to eternal life. But the question that remained was, would this man, who had once been a god, be able to find the answer to the greatest mystery of all? Gilgamesh's quest to find Utnapishtim was fraught with peril. He wandered through vast arid deserts. His body ached with every step, and his mind was tormented by the ghost of his friend. His journey took him to the end of the world, to a place where the sun sets and rises, a place guarded by scorpion men. These were half men, half scorpion creatures who stood guard over the gate to the land of the dead, a chilling detail that shows the depth of Mesopotamian mythology. These creatures were terrifying and powerful, but Gilgamesh, driven by his terror of death, faced them without fear. He recounted his story to them, his grief and his quest for immortality, and in a moment of surprise, they took pity on him and allowed him to pass. He then entered a dark, terrifying tunnel that led through the mountain of Mashu, a place so dark that it was said to be 1,000 leagues long. The psychological toll of this journey was immense. Imagine walking for what feels like an eternity in complete darkness. The only sound the echo of your own footsteps and the ghosts of your own fears. This was not a hero's walk. It was a penitent's crawl, a journey into the deepest, darkest parts of his own psyche. After what felt like an eternity, he emerged from the other side into a land of shimmering beauty, a place where the trees grew not with fruit, but with jewels and precious stones. This bizarre and beautiful detail, a land of pure fantasy, was a stark contrast to the darkness he had just endured. A historical fact from ancient Mesopotamian beliefs is that their afterlife was not a place of paradise, but a dark and dusty underworld. The land Gilgamesh entered was a place that no living man was ever meant to see. He had made it to the end of the world, to the shores of the cosmic ocean. But the question that remained was, how would he cross an ocean that no mortal could cross? Gilgamesh, having survived the desert and the dark tunnel, now stood at the edge of the vast, terrifying cosmic sea. This was not a sea of water, but a sea of death, a place where no mortal could cross without a special guide. On the shores of this sea lived a mysterious figure, a ferryman named Uruk. Uruk was the keeper of the ferry that crossed the waters of death, a figure reminiscent of the Greek Quran. Gilgamesh, in a state of desperation, confronted the ferryman, his body gaunt and his mind weary. He saw Gilgamesh not as a hero, but as a ragged, desperate man, and he refused to help him. Gilgamesh, in a fit of rage, destroyed the stone talismans that the ferryman used to guide his boat through the dangerous waters. This act, a moment of pure, desperate violence, seemed to have destroyed his only chance of crossing. But Uruk, seeing Gilgamesh's immense strength and his desperate resolve, proposed a solution. Gilgamesh would have to cut down 120 trees and fashion them into poles to propel the boat across the sea. A bizarre detail is that the poles had to be used in such a way that Gilgamesh's hands would not touch the deathly waters, a rule that highlights the unique peril of the cosmic sea. Gilgamesh, his body fueled by a desperate hope, did as he was told, and the two men set off on their perilous journey. The sea was treacherous, and the waves were not of water, but of death and chaos, a psychological manifestation of the fear that drove Gilgamesh. The journey was long and grueling, a testament to Gilgamesh's unyielding will. But as they finally neared the shore, a strange sight came into view. The land of Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of the Great Flood, a man who had been granted eternal life by the gods themselves. But the question that remained was, would this man be willing to share his secret with a mortal king? Gilgamesh finally reached the shore and stood before the immortal man, Utnapishtim. He was a being of ancient wisdom, a man who had seen the beginning and the end of the world. Gilgamesh, in a moment of pure vulnerability, recounted his entire story, his tyrannical reign, his friendship with Enkidu, his grief, and his terrifying realization of his own mortality. He pleaded with Utnapishtim, asking him for the secret to eternal life. He saw Utnapishtim as a god, a figure who held the key to his own salvation. But Utnapishtim was not what he expected. He was a calm, sad man, a figure burdened by the weight of his own immortality. He looked at Gilgamesh with a deep, profound pity, and he began to tell him his story, the story of the Great Flood. He recounted how the gods, angry and tired of the noise of humanity, had decided to wipe them all out with a great flood. It was a terrifying story of divine cruelty and indifference. But one god, the god Ea, took pity on Utnapishtim and whispered the secret of the coming flood to him. He told him to build a boat, a bizarre, cube-shaped vessel, and to fill it with his family, all the animals, and all the craftsmen of the city. A fascinating historical fact is that this flood myth, which is found on the tablet of Gilgamesh, is the oldest known version of the Great Flood narrative and has been found to be a likely precursor to many other flood myths, including the one found in the Bible. Utnapishtim followed the god's instructions, and when the flood came, he and his family were the only survivors. He described the terror of the storm, the gods themselves cowering in fear, and the profound loneliness of being the last of his kind. When the flood was over, the gods were filled with remorse, and they granted Utnapishtim and his wife immortality, but only because they were the sole survivors. But the question that remained was, why was he telling Gilgamesh this story? What was the purpose of this long, tragic tale? Utnapishtim finished his story, but the secret of immortality was not what Gilgamesh expected. It was not a potion or a magical word, but a state of being that was given to him by the gods, a gift that he could not share. Utnapishtim, seeing Gilgamesh's immense disappointment, decided to give him a test, a final, cruel psychological challenge. He told Gilgamesh that if he was truly worthy of eternal life, he would be able to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. It was a test of his will, a test to see if he had the same kind of resilience that was needed to survive a world-ending flood. Gilgamesh, filled with a newfound hope, sat down to begin his vigil, determined to pass the test. But the moment he sat, the profound exhaustion of his long, perilous journey, the psychological trauma of Enkidu's death, and the sheer mental fatigue of his quest washed over him. He fell asleep almost instantly, a bizarre detail that shows the human limits of his strength. Utnapishtim, ever the wise and subtle figure, instructed his wife to place a loaf of bread beside Gilgamesh for every day he was asleep. When Gilgamesh woke, a week later, he saw the 7 loaves of bread in various states of decay, from fresh to moldy. The truth was laid bare. He had failed. He was a man, and a man must sleep. His mortality was an inescapable part of his nature, and no amount of heroism or divine blood could change that. The test was not just a test of his will, it was a test of his humanity. A historical fact from ancient Mesopotamian culture is that they believed that sleep was a temporary death, a moment where the soul left the body. The test of sleep was a profound metaphor for Gilgamesh's inability to cheat death. He had tried to become a god, but his human nature, his need for sleep, was a testament to his inescapable mortality. But the question that remained was, what would Gilgamesh, now faced with his own failure, do? Gilgamesh, a man defeated, was on the verge of returning to Uruk, his quest a failure. Utnapishtim, however, had a change of heart. He saw the profound sadness in Gilgamesh's eyes, the deep human sorrow that had driven him across the world. He decided to offer him a final, small chance at a different kind of immortality. He told Gilgamesh about a secret plant, a plant that grew at the bottom of the cosmic sea, a plant that would not grant eternal life. It would restore youth, making an old man young again. It was a plant that held the power of regeneration, a kind of second chance at life. This was Utnapishtim's final gift, a small act of kindness from a man who had seen too much sorrow. Gilgamesh, his hope renewed, tied stones to his feet and plunged into the sea. He found the plant, a bizarre, thorny weed that pricked his hands and bled as he pulled it from the seabed. It was a plant that felt alive, a painful but beautiful detail that shows the difficulty of obtaining this kind of power. I brought the plant to the surface and rejoiced, his quest now a success. He planned to take it back to Uruk and share it with his people, to give them a taste of the immortality he had so desperately sought. He was no longer a selfish king. He was a hero who wanted to share his victory. But as he made his way back to Uruk, a profound, tragic moment occurred. He decided to rest by a well, placing the plant on the ground while he bathed. A snake, drawn to the plant's magical scent, emerged from the water and ate the plant. The snake shed its skin and was reborn, its youth restored. This bizarre and poignant detail explains the ancient belief that snakes gain their immortality by shedding their skin. Gilgamesh, who had journeyed across the world for a chance at a second life, had lost it in a moment of carelessness. The sorrow he felt was a profound, silent one, a feeling of pure, unadulterated loss. But the question that remained was, what did this final tragic loss mean for his legacy and his return to his city? Defeated and heartbroken, Gilgamesh returned to Uruk. His quest had been a failure. He had lost his best friend, failed a divine test, and had his last chance at immortality stolen by a snake. He was no longer the arrogant king who had left his city. He was now a humble, weary man, a figure burdened by the weight of his own failures. But as he and the ferryman Mershanabi approached the city, a change came over him. He looked at the walls of Uruk, the very walls he had built with his own hands, and saw them with a new perspective. They were not just a symbol of his power, but a testament to the power of human endurance. They had survived floods, famines, and the wrath of gods, and they would continue to stand long after he was gone. He was not a god, but he had built something that would outlive him. A small, subtle historical fact is that the walls of Uruk were a real physical structure, a testament to the engineering prowess of the Sumerian people. Gilgamesh, the man who had sought to be a god, had now found a different kind of immortality. Not through eternal life, but through his legacy. He realized that his true immortality was not in his divine blood, but in the monuments he had built and the stories he had created. He had a story to tell, a story of his journey, his friendship, his despair, and his ultimate realization of the beauty and the sorrow of the human condition. He wrote his story down on a clay tablet, an act that was both a final act of humility and a final act of hubris. It was his way of ensuring that his name would be remembered not as a tyrant, but as a man who had faced death and had come to terms with it. But the question that remained was, how would his people and his city remember him? Gilgamesh's journey had been a long and painful one, but it had transformed him from a tyrannical king into a wise and humble ruler. He returned to Uruk and began to govern with a new sense of compassion and justice. He no longer demanded the right of the first night. He no longer overworked his people. He was now a king who understood the fragility of life and the immense value of every living moment. His story, inscribed on a series of clay tablets, was his final testament, his gift to humanity. It was the story of a man who had everything, lost it all, and in the process found a deeper, more profound purpose. It was a story that served as a moral compass for a new generation of heroes. He was the first hero to not just be strong, but to be wise. He was not a god, but he had faced the gods and had lived to tell the tale. This is the truth behind the legend. Gilgamesh was the world's first superhero, not because he was 2/3 divine, but because he was 1/3 human. It was his human part that drove him to seek a friend, to mourn his loss, and to fear his own death. And it was his human part that made him realize that true greatness wasn't in immortality, but in building a legacy that would outlive him. He had faced the terrifying reality of his own mortality, and had found a way to not just survive it, but to find a different kind of meaning. He was the first hero to grapple with the deepest psychological questions of human existence. But the question that remained was, what would we, in the modern age, learn from his ancient tale? The legacy of Gilgamesh is not in his superhuman strength or his battles against gods and monsters. His true legacy is in his humanity, in his profound journey of self-discovery. He was the first hero to face the fear of death head-on and to find meaning in a finite life. He was the first to show that the greatest power a person can possess is not the power to defeat a monster, but the power to accept one's own mortality and to find a way to live a meaningful life in spite of it. His story has endured for thousands of years, a testament to its universal and timeless themes. It is a story about the dangers of hubris, the profound bond of friendship, the terror of loss, and the ultimate realization that the most heroic act of all is to live and to leave a legacy. A bizarre detail about the tablets is that they were found in the ruins of the library of the great king Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, a testament to how revered the story was in ancient times. It was so important that it was preserved for thousands of years, waiting to be rediscovered by a new generation of people who still grapple with the same questions. We see Gilgamesh in every hero who battles his own inner demons, in every person who faces the inevitability of their own death and still chooses to live with courage. He was a tyrant who became a hero, a demigod who became a man, and a legend who became a timeless symbol of the human condition. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than just a story. It is a profound psychological and philosophical text that asks us to consider what it means to be human and to be truly alive. He was a mythic figure, yes, but he was also the first of us, the first to face the great darkness and find a light within. The sun sets on the ancient city of Uruk, its walls still standing, a silent testament to the man who built them. The dust settles on the clay tablets, their words a quiet whisper across the ages. The epic has been told, the journey is over, but the questions linger. The sound of the wind through the vast, empty desert is the only sound you hear. The story of Gilgamesh is not just a myth. It is the story of all of us, a story of our shared journey towards the inevitable. It is a story of how we, too, must learn to be brave in the face of our own endings, and to find a way to build a legacy that will outlast us all. We are all Gilgamesh, a beautiful and terrible mix of the divine and the mortal, forever seeking a way to be remembered. Now, listen closely to the final echoes of the epic, and let the silence fill you with its meaning.